welcome to this episode of TraderTalk TV. My name is Lindsay Rowntree. I'm from ExchangeWire. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Armstrong. He is VP of Product at Eyeota. Rob, delighted to have you with us.
Hi, Lindsay. Great to be with you. Excited for our session today.
Me too. So today we're talking about the role of cohort-based onboarding in the future of marketing. So there's lots to unpick there. The word cohort is probably going to be a big buzzword of this year and beyond. So it'd be interesting to find out exactly what you mean by cohort-based onboarding and kind of the challenge it is looking to solve within the industry. So I'll kick off with kind of asking you, I guess, a bit of a summary about what it is and why it's important.
Sure, yeah. So as we all know, there's a lot of shifts happening in the digital ecosystem with regard to privacy and a cookieless world, although it's not as soon as we were planning as early as last week. There's still very much a big change coming to how advertising works across the internet. And so as we think about the challenges that agencies and brands have in reaching audiences, the cohort solution is one that taps into first-party data in a novel way that unearths quite a bit of value that is already sitting within the brand's data set. And so it's also something that is well thought out in terms of how the world will look like in the future and something that could be done today.
Brilliant. And I guess the big thing here is it's the bridging the gap of third-party cookies, particularly for those kinds of companies that don't have access to a wealth of first-party data. This is where, for me, it gets very interesting, where there are many marketers think they can rely on first-party data, but if you haven't got access to that or you can't scale that, that's where I think this will become a very interesting topic for them to want to find out more about. So first of all, it's good to understand exactly the challenges he's looking to solve. So what are the challenges with today's data that cohort-based onboarding will look to really kind of get into the teeth into?
Yeah, so I'd love to maybe share my screen and we could go through a little bit.
Please do.
All right. There's two main very powerful groups that have quite a bit of impact on how advertising in the internet works. First and foremost is the technology companies that control how we access the internet, how we engage with content. And those are primarily Apple and Google. And so here we see their logos because from two different angles, with Chrome, we know that there's a plan to get rid of cookies, but there's also a plan to support alternative advertising use cases and components. The first sort of advent of a cohort has come out of the privacy sandbox, and Flock is the first of a number of different proposals that we're very excited about in terms of enabling cohort-based advertising. The other is Apple's approach to privacy being a very prominent leading image of their brand and is an effective strategy considering their battle with the big tech titans and trying to differentiate themselves. And so we've seen Apple clamp down on the IDFA, and this is something that they're looking to continue to do. And we'll see how that goes, because there's actually a third body that arguably is the most powerful, and that is the regulatory environment and governments who can set laws and enforce penalties for breach of laws. And so the big hot news of the last week is that because of what went on in Europe, Google has stepped back from their timetable and has agreed to submit their plans to a regulatory body in the UK. So there's a lot of, as some folks would say, a 3D chess game being played, but this creates a degree of uncertainty, right? And it creates also great opportunities for thinking freshly about how to do marketing and advertising, especially when it comes to first-party data, which is considered to be much more prominent, valuable, and has direct consumer engagement, which is really important these days.
And it must be an absolute minefield for brands having to navigate around the likes of big walled gardens like Google and Apple, and also the regulatory aspect of it as well, particularly for global brands that have to deal with different cross-border regulatory injunctions, if you like. And also the news from Google that came out only a few days ago that it might make brands think, oh, phew, I've got a bit longer with cookies. I haven't got to worry about this just yet. But actually, is that the wrong approach? Should they be going, okay, this gives me more time to really test and learn and prepare and understand what a world without a third-party cookie can and will look like?
That's right. I think you said it there, Lindsay. Like, testing is really important at this stage. Cookies are still the economic building block of the internet and power advertising, and there's no doubt that this timetable that we had previous to last week was quite unrealistic. It was very aggressive, and it was for the industry at large, it was going to be a very big challenge and a very big cliff to jump off of, and hope that we had the parachute early next year. So the new timelines are very specific, and we're taking them very seriously. I don't see them changing here on out. And the specificity of having a concurrent strategy where you can actually use the new capabilities from the sandbox in addition to the existing cookie-based methodology, I think that's a very brilliant move. That 9-month period is where we're going to find a lot of learnings, and it's really up to every brand to invest part of their budget in testing these new capabilities so that they are really sure of that parachute, and that they have a number of different alternatives that are in replace of the cookie at the end of 2023.
And so how do brands feel about data and their control over data and what they can do with it?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. If we think about first-party data, I think, as we said, it's very valuable because it's something that comes directly from the consumer. And even in the world of cookies, a third-party cookie is seen as something that comes from an entity that no one really knows as a consumer, and that can be a bit spooky. Whereas a first-party cookie, or logging into a site and giving over my information, I know who has my information. And so it's seen as a much more clear above-board practice. So when we've studied this with Forrester, and we've identified with them that 70% of brands actually have a very high value of first-party data, and that makes sense. However, only 48%, about half, haven't even used their first-party data yet. And this is the age-old problem: more data, more problems. Data is not easy to use. It's great to talk about, but to actually put into workflow and make an efficient outcome out of data is much harder said than done. It requires a lot of resources and investment typically.
Sorry, carry on.
And so lastly, as we think about first-party data, what is it? It's actually customers I already have. So one of the interesting concepts we're going to talk about today is how first-party data can help acquire new customers, which is actually the highest priority of all these metrics coming out, is that acquiring new customers is a priority, which is no surprise.
And let's take things right back and understand exactly what we mean by first-party data, because there'll be marketers out there that will think that, well, if I've got first-party data, it means it's a customer I've already converted. I have their details because they bought something or they've used a product or service of mine. How will that help me get new customers? What do you mean by first-party data? So what exactly do we mean, and how can they get the scale from that?
Yeah, so first-party data is any breadcrumb of information that is received from consumers based upon their engagement with your properties. And that could be your microsites, your social media pages. It could be advertising that you deliver to the user. And it could also be offline things that happen, such as direct mail. And so all these touch points create opportunities to engage with consumers and also for them to engage back. We've seen a lot of activity, for example, in the social context with promoting content and earned media, because that is a great way to create engagement with customers without actually spending hard dollars on the media itself. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a customer today, although it typically does, because that's a great record. Typically, if you have a customer, you have a good understanding of what they've spent with you. And in the registration process, they're providing a lot more information than just someone who visits the website. But we should think holistically about first-party data as being very broad and having many different forms and flavors.
And there's the old adage, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And you mentioned before about the almost half of marketers fail to leverage their first-party data sources. There seems like a disconnect in certain among certain marketers, where there's one department collecting all this data and the other department doesn't know they have it, doesn't know what to do with it. So if they have this data, do they understand exactly where it's come from, how they can use it, whether they got consent for it? Is there a lot of education required there still in terms of what first-party data can do?
Right. Yeah. So I think I'm so engaged with you, I fell a slide behind. This is such a great chat, Lindsay. But just real quick, so we don't skip over, here's a few views of what type of data we're talking about in terms of the construct or collection. And so we talked about purchase data, but also surveys, loyalty and rewards programs, et cetera. And then research data relates to what's happening on my website or what information can I find out about certain markets based on the information I have. And then getting to your question, there are absolutely challenges. Data can be very siloed. And that silo creates walls and lack of linkage between data sets. Typically, any data set that you can link together with another makes both much more valuable. And so this is an opportunity for brands to consider and explore. The other component is just the users themselves. What is their consent path, and how much have they actually gone through a process where they're allowing data to be used in a certain manner? For example, if you want to create a modeling program on your users, do you know that, have they agreed for that data to be shared with a third party if you're working with a third party to do modeling? If you're actually, some brands might look to actually make a data asset out of their users and create revenue streams from that, because some brands have really rich data. So that's a whole nother level of regulatory importance. And so privacy is obviously first and foremost, and privacy does create a challenge compared to what we're used to, which is having no restrictions and a bit of a Wild West. And so these considerations make for data to be potentially challenging in terms of scale. But the data that does come in and does have these tight controls on how they were acquired does create really rich opportunities with that data, because it's very accurate and it has above board ethics to be used and with confidence by the brand.
And I guess this is where the cohort-based onboarding comes into play, right? Because it's for those marketers that necessarily need to fill that gap, the yawning chasm that third-party data may well leave with them, where they've been able to target, using broad brushstrokes and kind of many different types of audiences. Then they won't have that ability to be able to do that any further. They feel they can't get the scale with first-party data. That's what this next stage looks like then in that case.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think let's take a step back a bit and talk about onboarding. And I think when we talk about onboarding, typically it's been, especially in certain markets like the US, it's thought of as deterministic, which is effectively a one-to-one match with a specific individual and now reaching that individual online. In the one-to-one context, it has really great utility. There's ways to use that select offline data set. And based on the connection online, there's a necessary drop-off rate or a match rate. So one of the challenges is that I only get a subset of the actual users or customers that I have today through that process. But once I have them, I can reach them very targeted manner, and that's very effective for certain strategies. So drawing a distinction between deterministic onboarding and cohort onboarding, there's a sense in which cohorts are based upon a cluster of users, which doesn't need an individual identifier such as an email address or phone number. And since there's no need for that type of level of PII data, you can actually use a much broader set of data in your system. So we talked about website activity, we talked about research information, survey information. This doesn't necessarily come with email address and certainly not purchase level information. So there's a sense in which there's a lot of data that's left on the table with deterministic, whether it's the match rates or the fact that it's narrowed to those with a deterministic identifier. So opening up that lens, so to speak, allows for all offline data sets to be used. And it also goes after a bit of a different type of individual. Instead of reaching those who are already in your system, you're actually using that data, your first-party data, in this offline context to go after those who are very similar and the most likely to be the existing customers you already have. And that can be very powerful for that metric we showed earlier, that 71% of brands looking to get more customers. If I don't have the customer today and I want to get them, deterministic onboarding doesn't really help me do that. It helps me reach and engage and cross-sell. And we'll talk a bit more about that later.
And just from my understanding, where do cohorts sit in relation to probabilistic data? So we used to always talk about deterministic versus probabilistic, and everybody wanted deterministic and thought probabilistic wasn't good enough because it meant that they were probably this or probably that. Where do cohorts sit? Are they the same as probabilistic? Are they somewhere in between?
Right. So there is a sense in which it is a probabilistic approach, given that we're reaching a group of users who have very high indexing similarities. So for example, I'm reaching sports enthusiasts who are of a certain age group. And in this case, as we're looking at the picture, men, and it looks like maybe they're in an apartment, so they probably are in an urban environment. So this is a type of cohort example where I might know that in this zip code, in this region, with this gender and this type of interest, I could get a very high engagement factor with similar types of folks as what my customer base looks like. So yes, there is a probabilistic nature to it. I think probabilistic versus deterministic, we could probably talk about that for an hour. So much in our world today is driven by recommendations and AI, whether it's the music I listen to, the things I do online and what I look for in terms of news, my social feeds. So I've always struggled being in product. Why is deterministic seen as so much better when all around us, probabilistic things are happening to improve our daily life? And so I think there is a sense that probabilistic methods have created very large scale and almost more spray and pray. We're not talking about spray and pray here. We're being very specific about the cohorts we're going after. And it's within those cohorts where there is a degree of grouping of users. And so maybe not all are exactly the right fit, but it's still a very scientific method that still gets to a very precise set of cohorts. And that's the goal here, is to get to maximize the budget, maximize the impact of the media spend and investment, and return on that investment with new customers coming in.
I see, that makes sense. And so in what scenarios would I use deterministic data versus cohort data? What are the areas in which I can apply them and make the most of them?
Sure. So deterministic, as we said, these are customers already in the system. So creating that retention and upsell of the next product line or the fall clothing launch, and you know that they already spent last year, that's a great opportunity. Personalizing content. If you have 9 different things you're selling and you know a subset of your users sell a certain or engaged and have propensity to buy against a type of product line, then that's an effective strategy. And then also trying to upsell them into other categories and expand that relationship of lifetime value. So those are very effective ways for deterministic. But on the cohort side, it's really much more about acquisition of net new, driving down those who may have awareness in the funnel to actually a conversion state, and creating an overall customer experience where they have a deeper understanding of the brand and awareness of the brand. And this is where effective prospecting can be very powerful because it's based on facts. It's based on what really has happened in your data set, what really are the similarities, and using that to then go and acquire new customers.
And as you say, I guess it's important, while they both do quite different things, it's important not to silo them because one can certainly inform the other.
That's right. Yeah. As we see here, very different approaches. And certainly you would think they're very complementary. But ironically, as we talk about cohort today, and as you said earlier, it's probably a new concept to a lot of folks. And that's an interesting moment in time. And certainly privacy is driving some of this need to think differently. But it's also something that's been around. And I think we're discovering just how powerful it is as we make it available to clients and partners.
And so how does this work in the real world then?
Yeah, great. Your questions are so well aligned with the slides. You would think we coordinated a bit.
I'm a pro at this, you see.
You're very good. So talking about Greg's Groceries. So this is a real life example of a company in the UK that has 1.5 million holders of loyalty cards. So they have an understanding of the SKU level purchase data and also where the customer is from, how far they drive to the stores, what stores they frequent at what time of day. These are all very important metrics, as well as just general demographics. So in terms of those spending habits, those patterns, along with the gender of the user and their area of location, which location is a very interesting proxy into lifestyle, net worth, affinity. So putting these things together, was we were able to see a very large activation service. So one of the interesting things about this cohort onboarding, it's similar to deterministic, is you can run this omni-channel across many different types of platforms. And so it's very portable into different use cases and areas to reach users. And so what this was able to do is acquire net new users and send that to omni-channel, as well as increasing revenue and optimize loyalty and achieve business growth. So those 1.5 million customers actually resulted in, with those 3 different components, resulted in over 250 different granular targeted segments of various cohorts. So that's a lot of custom activity happening. And it's much more specific than you can get from a third-party data set, simply those who like to shop at a grocery store with certain products within a grocery store.
And so this is really interesting. And I want to, if I'm a marketer now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, oh, I must have this data. There must be a way I can get this data or start using it. What are the considerations I need to have? What do I need to, how do I start? Right.
So I think it's important to identify the data that you have and understand the nature of it. So one of the important things is, how often is it changing? That frequency of change is important to consider within a cohort strategy. But effectively, there should be an audit, so to speak, of what data is available within my walls and how portable is it. And then from there, there's solution providers that can build that modeling of the data to create the cohort capabilities. And then you need partners to make it available in platforms so that you can go and activate against that data.
And so what really are the key benefits of cohort onboarding and how, how it can apply to, from a small company to a large multinational company, kind of how can they make the most of it?
Right. So again, I think it's important to draw the line and difference with deterministic, since that's a pretty common framework for folks.
Definitely.
So with deterministic, we can reach the same customers using PII. It's only available in certain markets. I mean, that's a big component here is if I'm a multinational brand, how can I use all data consistently so that I can learn and optimize? One of the things that's interesting about using data that I've acquired, it may actually drive a lot of strategy around what data I should go and acquire in addition as a first party. What should I ask for? How should I create programs to acquire more first party data? So the more narrow, the more fragmented that strategy is based on how you can test the data, the harder it is to create a holistic approach that works across all markets. And with deterministic, also along with the country component, is it's very hard to scale. And in certain markets, it's very, very hard to get that consent and opt-in. And those requirements likely aren't going to get easier. They're likely to get harder with the way the pendulum is swinging on privacy. So with cohorts, we can reach new customers and prospects, and it doesn't need PII. I mean, that's a huge opportunity to expand the data set that you're thinking about, and then make it much more holistic from a global perspective. And last but not least is that cohorts today are still using the IDs of today in the industry. So you can build a cohort model. Effectively, it will still use some form of cookies, mobile IDs, because that's what we're using today. But what's really exciting and what's got us very hopeful and eager for the future is what's coming out of the privacy sandbox and the consistency of the cohort methodologies that are being discussed within proposals like Fledge and Flock. And so the future is very bright, and it's something that we're very excited about at Eyeota.
So the development of cohort, because it's democratized to a degree, and there's lots of different companies, lots of different types of people that are working to build this technology and remove our reliance on a third-party cookie, it means that actually cohorts are being future-proofed with each passing day. As new regulation, new things come in, the cohort is adapting and evolving as it should do to be able to cater to what the current needs are.
That's right.
And so you're not saying get rid of deterministic, focus on cohort. You're saying there should be a healthy balance of the two?
Yes, I would say at both ends, absolutely. And I think that it doesn't necessarily need to start globally. It could start in certain markets, and it doesn't need to start with all data. It's good to iterate on these things. But given the prominence of deterministic onboarding, it seems like we have quite an imbalance in the industry right now in terms of all eggs in one basket, and that basket has some holes in it, and they're not closing. They're not getting stitched up.
Brilliant. I mean, that's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you. I've learned a lot from that myself. I understand a lot more about cohorts versus deterministic now, and hopefully our audience will too. Thank you very much, Rob, for joining me today.
Thanks, Lindsay. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. And this has been Trader Talk. We'll see you next time.